The last few weeks have been pretty fun. If you missed it, we rebuilt the entire S4 suspension. Before, we were riding like a monster truck, and now we're about 4 inches lower and the car looks and drives so much better. In the last episode, we specifically got the car aligned, and on top of that, we adjusted damping so that the car was well set up for the bumpy roads that I live by. In other words, a big chapter of this car's life is closed. The suspension build is pretty much complete. I was really hoping to start the new chapter for this car, the next larger mods that set us up for much better power down the road. But if we're gonna do this car, we should do it right, and I found something that needs done as soon as possible. If you saw the last TT episode, you'll think this is pretty damn ironic. And trust me, the irony isn't lost on me. Through the process of working on the suspension for this car, I noticed an age-related tear in the driver's CV axle boot. And I caught this really early. In fact, we caught it early enough that the car hadn't even started slinging grease. And I've intentionally not driven the car much so it doesn't get any worse. Since we caught this so early, I think we're gonna be able to save the axle. But not if we don't act fast. Today we're gonna try to reboot the outer side of the axle. It's definitely a messier job than replacing the whole axle, but it'll prevent us from worrying about an aftermarket unit failing. And especially for a car with as much power potential as the S4, saving the OEM axle and simply rebuilding it is very high on my list of priorities. This is a CV boot kit. It comes with new grease, new clips, new boots, and pretty much everything you would need to do the job. I also got some gloves and paper towels to try to keep the job as mess-free as possible. Since we're keeping the stock axle, I also ordered a new stock axle bolt. The one on the TT gave us no trouble. Let's hope the S4 is the same. I was shocked when the TT bolt didn't give us any struggle. Unlike the bolt on the TT, this one seems to be giving us a bit more of a fight. It seems we need a bit more persuasion. This time it killed our Harbor Freight extension. Real shocker there. Let's try that again, but this time with overkill leverage. This was the most amount of torque I've ever had to put on a bolt to get it loose, and it felt like a bomb the whole time. Thankfully, we got it though, so we're good to continue the boot replacement.
We did it!
In most situations, a lot of people will say that if there's a tear in your CV boot, you should just replace the whole axle. And that's mainly because if there's a way for the grease to come out, there's definitely a way for moisture and debris to go in. This case is unique though. I only caught this so early because I've been under here so much with the suspension, so I'm happy to give rebooting it a try. And if for some reason it doesn't work, I'm willing to take that risk because it'll be fun to learn and try this anyways. Another motivating factor to simply rebooting it is the fact that it's an outer boot. If the tear was on the inner side, we'd have to take the whole axle out, and at that point, might as well just rebuild the whole thing. But with the outer one, we can just take the outer side off and leave the rest attached to the car. So it'll be a pretty quick fix, and it'll be something new. There's a couple ways you can get to the axle, but the easiest for me, because all my parts are new, is to just remove the pinch bolt. Then the spindle can slide over and you have access to the axle. You can work on this axle on either side of the spindle when you have the top disconnected like I do. Since I hadn't done the job before, I started on this side, but I highly suggest you do the other side because there's a lot more room. I end up switching to it about halfway through. The first thing we gotta do is get both of the clamps off if we want to remove this side of the CV axle from the axle shaft. I'm sure there's easier ways to do this, but for me a screwdriver worked pretty well. Next we gotta pop off the axle cage, and this is another really easy step. You simply screw in the bolt and the whole thing pops right out. I don't know if that works for every type of car, but for this one it worked great. I then spent some time cleaning up the grease on the splines of the axle shaft and removing the circlip. It's important to get these splines as clean as they possibly can be so we don't risk damaging the cage when we reinstall it. The circlip also comes off pretty easily with a screwdriver or a pick. This is part of how the joint stays in place. With the circlip off and the axle shaft clean, we're good to look at the joint itself. CV axles seem like really complicated technology, but they're actually pretty cool, and it's a simple concept. At their simplest, CV axles take the power from your engine and put them to the wheel. It's a spinning metal shaft with a joint on each side. These joints allow it to have more range of freedom at each end so that your suspension can travel up and down. Now that we have this open, we can get a better look at the cage. We want to clean out as much of the old grease as we possibly can. And if we're even going to consider reusing this joint, we need to inspect it for any damage or any sort of debris. And the good news is everything in here looks pretty good to go. So in other words, we caught this really early. You want to get as much grease as you can out, but it doesn't need to be spotless. In other words, you want to replace as much of the old grease with new grease as you possibly can. The kit comes with 2 packets of this grease, and you want to make sure that you use all of it. You want to make sure that the grease gets everywhere in this joint other than on the spline. These joints are just ball bearings in a cage, so they're pretty easy to fill if you just hold the packet close to them and squeeze it slowly. So long as it all gets in there, you should be good. As far as the second packet of grease, the instructions say that you should apply it into the rest of the boot. In order to do that, we need to put the boot onto the shaft, along with its clip and 2 little spacers that come with the kit as well. These replace the ones that were there before, and they go in the same way. And once both of those spacers are in, we can install the new circlip. This is going to keep them in place and get us ready to pack it with grease and reinstall the joint. Here's also where I decided to move to the other side so that there was more room. I took one final pass of cleaning the shaft before packing it with grease, just to make sure there was absolutely no debris in here. Once the rest of the grease is in here, we're ready to actually put the joint in place. The end of the axle has splines. Those splines are mirrored on the inside of the cage. Think of it as 2 gears turning. The shaft turns the cage, which turns the wheel hub. When you have these lined up and flush, you can take a hammer and gently tap the end of this. Light taps. You don't want to break anything. All you want to do is force the cage over the circlip so it's locked in place. If you have to smack it hard, it's probably not lined up right, or your splines are messed up and you've got a bigger problem. Once it won't go any further on, we're good to install the new clamps. And before you ask, no, you shouldn't use worm style clamps. These ones are pinch style, and they've intentionally got a lower profile so they don't hit anything. Because remember, this spins as fast as your wheel does, so any other type of clamp really wouldn't work. Look at that, the reboot's pretty much done. We are already ready to put the axle back into the hub and get ready to test everything out. In other words, reassembly time. Just like on the TT, this axle bolt has a specific torque sequence ritual. I'll toss the torques in the description, but you want to torque it once before the car's on the ground, and then once again on the ground. And don't be surprised when it's a lot of torque. Other than that, installation is exactly the same as when we took everything apart, but in reverse. And after applying a ridiculous amount of torque, thinking I was about to break my torque wrench, we're good to go, and we're good to actually enjoy the suspension. This install wasn't without its casualties though. We lost a Harbor Freight extension along with this driver that my neighbor let me borrow. Whoops. Looks like he's getting an early birthday present.
That was a lot easier than I thought it would be, to be brutally honest. I've heard a lot of horror stories about how terrible rebooting something can be, but honestly, it was kind of fun. Will it last? Who knows? The grease that was in there didn't even look bad, so there's a good chance it'll last quite a while, but I have a new axle or a rebuilt axle preemptively in the cart, so to say. Worst case, if it does go out, it'll be easy to swap it and we'll just do it then. But I think this was a really fun learning experience, and that's mostly why I did it. We went ahead and finished the suspension, and the car handles way better than I ever thought it would. I'm honestly really impressed by it. Throttle's great. Everything about the car is great, and I think it's pretty much ready for new power and more power with the swapped turbos. But preemptively, I do notice something that might be a bit of an issue. Currently, the brakes absolutely suck. They bite just fine, but they only bite at about halfway down the pedal travel. So I'm assuming there's just some sort of air in the brakes. So where I'm going with this is what we're gonna do now is try to get the brakes at least a little bit better. I think we might go with Brembos down the road, but for the time being, I think it just makes sense to try to get as much out of the stock calipers and the upgraded pads and rotors, which the car does have, because they're currently not performing the way that I know they should. The brakes in the TT actuate pretty much exactly when you step on the pedal, right at the beginning of the travel. So since these two have the same upgraded parts, this should be a lot better. And I thought it had to do with age. I thought maybe this was just an older car and maybe the brakes just weren't that good. But then I bought an even older car, being the E30, and those brakes are better than this car. So in other words, I think it's time we work on the S4 brakes and try to get them at least passable. Should be fun.
Like I mentioned, I think the final goal for this car before we go big turbos is to put much better brakes on it. But that's definitely not an excuse for why these stock brakes with upgraded pads and rotors are absolutely terrible. I have a pretty big hunch that it's honestly just a bubble that's been trapped in the system, so I picked up something to help. This is a Schwaben pressure bleeding kit. It's effectively an air pump that allows you to bleed pressurized fluid systems in your car. In this case, brakes. Generally, when you bleed brakes, you would need 2 people, but this kit claims to let you be able to do it all by yourself. Super useful if you're anything like me and don't have someone to help you. This thing was actually pretty cheap too, so I'm curious if it works as well as it says. First things first, we need to hook it up to the brake fluid reservoir. It comes with a replacement cap that hooks onto the pressure bleeder, and it screws right on. From here, it looks like we need to fill this puppy with brake fluid and assemble the rest of the hoses that connect it to the car. Now we're ready to pressurize the bleeder and see if there's any leaks in the system. You'll know right away if you have a brake line leak when you can see that the pressure won't actually stay constant. You should be able to pump it up to about 10 to 15 psi and it should remain constant. Mine was good to go, so we're ready to bleed the brakes. Like most cars, you're going to follow the specific brake bleeding order. You go furthest from the brake reservoir to the closest. Since the system's pressurized, you don't need to step on the brakes or anything like that. All you need to do is go to each wheel and open the bleeder until no more air bubbles come out. And if you look closely, you can tell our hunch might have been right. There were some pretty sizable bubbles that came out of here before it ran clear. With how quick this was compared to bleeding the brakes normally, I'm pretty happy with my new tool purchase. I'm curious what other uses I'll have for it, but I'm sure being able to bleed any sort of pressurized fluid is definitely going to come in handy in the future. I then replicated the same process on the remaining wheels, between each one checking to make sure the pressure didn't dip and we still had enough pressure to actually bleed the brakes. I will say it's pretty cool to be able to do this all by myself. With the final wheel bled, a day of work was nearing its end. I think the most fun part about using this tool is at the very end when you press the pressure relief valve. It basically sucks all the fluid out of the line leading to the reservoir, so none of it gets anywhere. New tools are always fun, and if you guys have any suggestions for more ones I should check out, let me know. I'm always looking for fun ones that'll help me with the jobs. I torqued the wheels and was finally ready to enjoy the suspension. I really haven't pushed the car too much since I did the suspension because I didn't really want to ruin the CV axle. But now, we really should be all good to go. And at the same time, we'll be able to check out if our brakes actually work better. It's been a week or so since I did that install, and the car is better than ever. The brakes are notably better, and there's a lot less pedal travel before they actually work. They're still not as good as I would imagine Brembo's to be, but for now, they are a lot better than they were. A lot less sketchy, in other words. And as far as the axle goes, great news. It's not clicking, and no grease seems to be trying to escape. Only time will tell how long that'll last, but I think, to be honest, we did a pretty good job, and I'm happy with the results. In the journey that is building a car, maintenance and fixes like this aren't always the most flashy, but they are also an important part of the story. Without them, the fun mods wouldn't have nearly as much value. So in other words, next episode, we'll be back to something fun. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, learned something, or want to see more, consider dropping a like and subscribing. It's the best way you can help support me. I've got a lot in store for the channel, and I hope you're excited. Either way, I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.